God has bigger plans for you. 2 Corinthians 12, 8 through 10. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it should leave me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you. For my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Oh, the manifold ways that God uses suffering. You know, suffering is an odd-shaped tool, isn't it, in the hands of the Lord? He can do all sorts of good with it, and yet we lay like a patient on a gurney waiting to be operated on, and we see the scalpel of his suffering, the tool in his hand, as he approaches us, and we squirm in any way possible to avoid the touch of that tool in our lives, especially I think in America today. Well, on March 3rd of 2020, I was diagnosed with diabetes. I have type 1 diabetes, and it was a shock and immediately changed my life forever. And it increased the measure of suffering that I will endure in this life. And while, of course, it doesn't compare with the pain and the impact and even the life shortening of many diseases, it's still a real suffering. And the question that came into my mind very soon after being diagnosed was, what purpose does God have in giving this suffering to me? And I think one of the questions that probably comes into the mind of most people who have big plans for their life and want to do a lot, and then have this kind of a sickness or other type of impact is, God, I wanted to do so much for you. I had such big plans. Why are you limiting me? And I just want to read a summary of a few of the good, powerful biblical uses that God has for suffering that John MacArthur Jr. has in his book on Job. God ordains that his children walk in sorrow and pain, sometimes because of sin, sometimes for chastening, sometimes for strengthening, and sometimes to give opportunity to reveal his comfort and grace. But there are times when the compelling issue in the suffering of the saints is unknowable, because it is for a heavenly purpose that those on earth can't discern. So what type of suffering was behind my diabetes? What did God want to do in me or through me with this suffering? That's the question. And God, in his mercy, he sometimes lets us wrestle with that for a long time. But for me, it was the very next morning that this was a piece. I'm going to read a quote from the devotional reading that I was doing. And you'll see how God changed me forever and blessed me through this thought. So let me just read it for you. It's from Only the Hungry Heart. You may have been in the fires and have been having a pretty hard and painful time in your spiritual life, but that only means that God has been preparing you for something more. No, God is not a God who believes in bringing everything to an end. He's always after something more. And if he has to clear the way for something more by devastating methods, the cross, well, that's all right. For it is something more that he is after. There is so much more, far, far transcending All are asking or thinking, more, more, more. It hits me like the opening gates at Disneyland. God is in the business of doing more. He didn't give me diabetes to limit me, to do less with me, but to do more in me and through me, because he's not a God of less. He's a God of more. And my problem is having too small, too limited of a plan for myself. I would never choose to give myself diabetes. But that's just because God has bigger plans for me than I would give myself. And so he allowed this into my life, again, not to limit me, but because his plans are bigger than I ever imagined. And God won't allow his plans to be pent up because our view of suffering is too small. Well, a few days after I was diagnosed, I was going to go visit a friend for coffee. And as I was driving in my car and thinking about this fact that God wants to do more through my diabetes, I found myself praising him, and for the first time said out loud, God, thank you for giving me diabetes. And so I want to personalize the verses that I read at the beginning and make them mine, because I think it gives it so much more than if we just read them and picture it as something outside of ourselves. But I hope this touches you as well in whatever suffering that God has brought into your life, just as he brought Paul's thorn in the flesh into his life. So here's my personalized version of 2 Corinthians 12, 9 and 10. God, I believe that your power is made perfect in my diabetes. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly in my diabetes, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with diabetes, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak and limited, then your strength is unleashed through me in new ways that were locked before. And I want more of you.